He comes here every morning because he has nowhere else to go, Daniel Whitman said loud enough for half the diner to hear, dropping a $20 bill on the counter as if it were something dirty. I was standing right there with a fresh cup of black coffee in my hand, and for a second, I forgot how to move. Mr. Harold Whitman sat in his usual booth by the window, the early sunlight stretching across the scratched vinyl table, catching the thin silver of his hair. He didn't look up at his son. He didn't look at me either. He just kept his hands folded neatly beside his oatmeal, as if this were nothing more than a comment about the weather. Daniel's suit probably cost more than I made in a month waiting tables at Maple Street Diner. His watch flashed under the fluorescent lights. His car, a dark Mercedes parked crookedly out front, was still ticking as it cooled. The contrast between the two men could not have been sharper. One arrived in polished shoes and confidence. The other came in every morning at 7:15 a.m., walking slowly from the bus stop 2 blocks away, wearing the same navy blazer that had seen better days but was always pressed, always clean. I had been serving Mr. Whitman for almost 8 months. He ordered the same thing every single day, a bowl of oatmeal with sliced bananas, black coffee, no sugar, and a side of toast he barely touched. He paid in cash, exact change, counting it carefully from a worn leather wallet. Sometimes he left a $1 tip. Sometimes nothing at all. It never bothered me. There was something about the way he said, "Thank you, Emily," that made up for the rest. He never called me sweetheart or miss. He remembered my name from the second week I started working there. Daniel laughed softly when his father didn't respond. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he said, leaning one hand on the back of the booth. "Everyone here knows you lost everything." A few customers glanced over their coffee cups, then quickly looked away. I felt my face burn, though I wasn't the one being addressed. Mr. Whitman lifted his spoon, took a slow bite, and swallowed before speaking. "Good morning, Daniel." His voice was steady. Not defensive. Not embarrassed. Just steady. Daniel shook his head as if disappointed in a child. He pushed the $20 bill toward me again. "Keep the change. Maybe that'll cover his breakfast for the week." I stared at the bill but didn't pick it up. Something about the way he said it made it feel less like generosity and more like a performance. Mr. Whitman finally looked up, not at the money, but at his son. "I pay my own way," he said quietly. Daniel smiled, thin and impatient. "Not for long." And then he straightened his jacket and walked out, the bell above the diner door jingling too cheerfully for what had just happened. The room slowly exhaled. Conversations resumed in low murmurs. I stood there for a moment before sliding into the booth across from Mr. Whitman, something I had never done before. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He folded his napkin carefully beside his bowl. "People often mistake quiet for weakness," he said. He didn't sound hurt. He didn't sound angry. If anything, he sounded tired. I glanced toward the window, watching Daniel's car pull away. "Does he always talk to you like that?" I asked before I could stop myself. Mr. Whitman's eyes followed the car until it disappeared around the corner. "Only when he thinks I have nothing left," he replied. The way he said it made something shift in my chest. Nothing left. The words didn't match the man sitting in front of me. His blazer might have been old, but the stitching was tailored. His cufflinks, small and silver, were engraved. And the watch on his wrist, simple, understated, was not something you bought at a department store. I had noticed it before but never thought much of it. Now, I wondered. Why does he think that? I asked gently. Mr. Whitman reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Inside, the smell of bacon and fresh pancakes filled the air. The morning felt ordinary. But the silence at our booth felt anything but. "Because," he said at last, setting the cup down with deliberate care, "he believes the story he created." I frowned slightly. "What story?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if measuring something. "Not my uniform." Not my name tag. Something else. That I handed him everything, he said. And that there's nothing more to give. I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't used to conversations about everything and nothing over oatmeal. I was used to splitting checks and refilling coffee. But something told me this wasn't just about a family disagreement. And is he right? I asked softly. A faint smile touched the corner of Mr. Whitman's mouth. Not bitter. Not amused. Just knowing. He's right about one thing, he said. I did hand him everything. He paused, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table. What he doesn't know, he added, is what I kept. The bell above the door jingled again as new customers walked in, bringing in a rush of cool morning air. I stood up automatically, instinct taking over. Orders to take. Coffee to pour. But as I walked back toward the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into the middle of something much bigger than a father and son arguing over breakfast. Because Mr. Harold Whitman did not look like a man who had lost everything. He looked like a man waiting. And I had the strange sense that whatever he was waiting for, was almost here. The next morning, Mr. Harold Whitman arrived at exactly 7:15, just as he always did, as if the conversation from the day before had been nothing more than a passing cloud. The sky outside Maple Street Diner was pale and clear, and the air still carried that early spring chill that made the windows fog slightly from the warmth inside. I was refilling sugar dispensers when the bell above the door rang, and I looked up automatically. He gave me the same small nod he always did, steady and polite. Good morning, Emily, he said, his voice calm, almost measured. There was no sign that his son had stood in this very room less than 24 hours earlier and spoken to him like he was invisible. Good morning, Mr. Whitman, I replied, grabbing a clean mug before he even reached his booth. I poured his coffee before he sat down, the dark stream filling the cup with a soft hiss. He folded his coat carefully over the back of the seat and placed his leather wallet on the table beside his bowl of oatmeal when it arrived. Everything about him was routine. Predictable. Intentional. But something in his eyes felt sharper than before, like a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal it. The diner filled slowly with the usual crowd, construction workers in reflective jackets, two retirees who argued about baseball scores every morning, a mother with a toddler who liked to bang his spoon on the table. The rhythm of breakfast service carried on as always. Plates clinked. Coffee brewed. Orders were called out from the kitchen window. Yet I kept finding myself glancing toward Mr. Whitman's booth, replaying his words from the day before. What he does not know is what I kept. It echoed in my mind with a quiet weight. Around 7:45, I brought him a fresh napkin. He had barely touched his toast again. Did you sleep well? I asked without thinking, surprising myself with the familiarity of the question. He looked up, a faint smile touching his face. Well enough, he answered. Clarity often arrives before sleep does. I tilted my head slightly. Clarity about what? He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the dark swirl settle. About the difference between earning something and inheriting it, he said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. I thought about the way Daniel had stood in that booth, polished and certain, speaking as if the world belonged to him. I thought about the quiet steadiness of the man in front of me. They were so different that it almost felt impossible they were related. He seems very confident, I said carefully. Mr. Whitman gave a small nod. Confidence without gratitude is simply entitlement dressed well, he replied. The words were not bitter. They were observational, almost clinical, as if he were discussing a business report instead of his own son. That was the moment I realized something else. Mr. Whitman did not speak like a man who had been defeated. He spoke like a man who had once commanded rooms much larger than this diner. His posture, even when sitting, was straight. His sentences were precise. He listened fully before responding. There was nothing fragile about him except perhaps the way time had thinned his hair and slowed his walk. At 8:05, my manager, Carl, came out from the back office holding a clipboard. He paused near Mr. Whitman's table, hesitating for just a second. "Everything all right this morning, sir?" Carl asked politely. It struck me that he rarely addressed customers that way. Mr. Whitman met his gaze calmly. "Everything is exactly as it should be," he said. Carl nodded, almost respectfully, and walked away. I watched the exchange carefully. Later, while loading the dishwasher behind the counter, I leaned closer to Carl. "Do you know him?" I asked quietly. Carl wiped his hands on a towel and glanced toward the window booth. "Everyone in this town used to," he said. "Whitman Industries. Steel manufacturing. Construction materials. His company built half the commercial buildings within 50 miles. I stared at him. "Built?" Carl shrugged. "That is what people say. 5 years ago, he stepped down. Signed everything over to his son. At least that is the story." The story. The same word Mr. Whitman had used. I looked back toward the booth. He was finishing his coffee, dabbing his mouth with a napkin in that deliberate way of his. A man who built half the commercial buildings in the county did not lose everything overnight. And he certainly did not look surprised by his son's arrogance. He looked prepared. When I brought him the check, he placed exact change on the table again. $1 tip. As always. But this time, he slid something else across the table toward me. It was a folded business card, plain white, heavy stock. "Keep this," he said quietly. "In case you ever decide you want more than this place can offer." I blinked, caught off guard. "Mr. Whitman, I did not mean to intrude yesterday." He shook his head gently. "Kindness is not intrusion, Emily. It is a rare form of courage." He stood slowly, buttoning his blazer with steady hands. As he walked toward the door, he paused and looked back at the diner, at the sunlight catching the chrome stools, at the familiar morning noise. "Tomorrow may be slightly less ordinary," he said. Then he stepped outside into the cool air, leaving the bell above the door ringing softly behind him. I unfolded the card with careful fingers. It bore only a name and a title, Harold Whitman, founder. No company name. No address. Just that single word beneath his name. Founder. And for the first time, I understood that whatever Daniel believed about having everything might not be the whole truth. The next morning did not feel less ordinary at first. The sun rose over Maple Street the same way it always did, casting long stripes of light across the diner floor, catching the chrome edges of the counter stools and the glass pie case near the register. I arrived at 6:30, tied my apron, and unfolded the business card again before sliding it carefully into the pocket of my uniform. Harold Whitman, founder. No logo. No phone number printed in bold colors. Just a simple embossed name that felt heavier than the thin paper suggested. At exactly 7:15, the bell above the door rang. I did not need to look up to know it was him. His footsteps were slow but steady, measured like someone who had spent a lifetime walking through boardrooms rather than diners. He nodded once when our eyes met. "Good morning, Emily," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," I replied, already reaching for his mug. There was something different in the air, though nothing visible had changed. He sat in his usual booth, sunlight outlining the edge of his blazer. I placed the oatmeal in front of him, steam rising gently. "You said today might be less ordinary," I said carefully as I poured his coffee. He glanced at the window instead of answering. Outside, the street was still quiet except for a delivery van parked across from the diner. "Ordinary is often a matter of perspective," he said at last. "Sometimes what appears routine is simply preparation." Before I could respond, the low hum of a car engine rolled through the parking lot. It was not the uneven rumble of an old truck or the quick buzz of a compact car. It was smooth. Expensive. I turned instinctively. A black sedan, newer than anything usually parked outside Maple Street Diner, pulled into a space near the entrance. A second vehicle followed, another dark sedan. The construction workers by the counter paused mid-conversation. Even Carl looked up from the register. The first car door opened. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, holding a slim leather briefcase. He scanned the front of the diner before walking toward the entrance with purposeful steps. The bell rang again as he entered, bringing with him a faint scent of cold morning air and polished leather. He looked around once before his eyes landed on Mr. Whitman. His posture changed immediately. He approached the booth and stopped, just short of the table. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," he said respectfully. "We are ready whenever you are." The diner fell quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like a room waiting for a speech to begin. I stood frozen near the counter, coffee pot still in hand. Mr. Whitman dabbed his mouth with his napkin, then folded it neatly beside his bowl. He did not rush. He did not stand immediately. He finished his coffee first. "Thank you, Richard," he said calmly. "Please have a seat." The man in the gray suit sat across from him, placing the briefcase carefully on the table. A second man entered behind him, carrying a folder thick with documents. They did not look like debt collectors or messengers of bad news. They looked like executives. Professional. Prepared. I caught Carl staring openly now. "What is going on?" he whispered under his breath. I did not answer because I did not know. Mr. Whitman finally turned his attention toward me. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the counter, "would you join us for a moment?" My heart thudded. I glanced at Carl, who gave me a slight nod. I walked toward the booth, aware of every step, aware of every customer pretending not to listen. I slid into the seat beside the suited men, hands folded in my lap. Richard opened the briefcase and withdrew a document, placing it on the table. I caught glimpses of official letterhead, legal formatting, and bold type across the top of the first page. "As per your instruction," Richard said, "the transfer remains unexecuted. Authority has not been permanently relinquished." My breath caught. Mr. Whitman nodded once. "And the board?" he asked. "Awaiting your confirmation," Richard replied. The second man opened the folder and revealed what looked like financial statements, shareholder records, and something that resembled a corporate seal. Mr. Whitman's gaze shifted toward the diner window where the black sedan sat quietly. "My son believes ownership is the same as control," he said evenly. "He forgets that control can be temporary." I stared at him, the pieces slowly aligning in my mind. "You did not lose everything," I said softly, almost to myself. He looked at me with that same measuring expression he had worn before. "No, Emily," he replied. I stepped aside. The word felt intentional. Not forced. Stepped aside implied choice. Strategy. Patience. "The documents you signed 5 years ago," Richard continued, "granted him operational authority. But the trust structure ensured ultimate oversight remained with you." Trust. Founder. The story Daniel believed. It was unraveling in real time. Outside, another car pulled into the lot. This one I recognized immediately. The same dark Mercedes from 2 mornings ago. Daniel stepped out quickly, his stride sharp, his expression already tense. He had not yet seen the other vehicles. He had not yet seen the men seated across from his father. Mr. Whitman glanced at the door just as the bell rang again. Daniel entered, stopping short when he noticed the suits, the open briefcase, the documents spread across the table. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel Whitman did not look confident. He looked uncertain. Mr. Whitman remained seated, hands calmly folded. "Good morning, Daniel," he said. "You are just in time." Daniel stopped 3 steps inside the diner, the easy confidence he usually wore slipping just slightly from his face. His eyes moved from the open briefcase to the documents on the table, then to the 2 suited men seated across from his father. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his tone sharp but no longer amused. Mr. Harold Whitman did not stand. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply folded his hands on the table, the same way he had every morning with his oatmeal. This, he said calmly, is clarity. Daniel gave a short, disbelieving laugh. If this is about the board meeting next quarter, I already told you that everything is handled. He stepped closer to the booth, glancing briefly at me as if noticing my presence for the first time. Why is she sitting here? He asked. His father's gaze did not waver. Because she has shown more respect in 8 months than you have in 5 years, he replied evenly. The words were not raised. They did not need to be. Daniel's jaw tightened. Dad, this is not the place for theatrics. Richard, the man in the gray suit, cleared his throat gently and slid one of the documents toward Daniel. Mr. Whitman, he said professionally, we are here to review the trust structure that governs operational authority at Whitman Industries. Daniel's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. Operational authority is mine, he said quickly. You know that. Richard nodded once. Operational authority was delegated to you, he corrected carefully. Ownership and ultimate oversight were not. The distinction hung in the air like a quiet verdict. Daniel looked at his father, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. You signed everything over, he said. 5 years ago. You were done. Mr. Whitman reached into his blazer pocket and withdrew a pair of reading glasses, placing them on the bridge of his nose with steady fingers. I signed a temporary transfer of management, he said. Not surrender. He glanced down at the papers briefly, then back up at his son. There is a difference. Around us, the diner had gone almost completely silent. The construction workers had stopped eating. The retirees had forgotten about baseball. Even the toddler at the corner booth sat quietly, watching the adults with wide eyes. Daniel picked up the document Richard had placed in front of him. His eyes scanned the page rapidly. This is old, he said. This is from before the restructuring. It was amended last month, Richard replied calmly. With the approval of the majority stakeholders. Daniel's head snapped up. Majority stakeholders? Mr. Whitman removed his glasses slowly. The ones who invested in me, he said. Not in you. Daniel stepped back as if the booth had suddenly grown too small. You said you trusted me, he said, and for the first time there was something raw in his voice. I did, his father answered. Trust is not the same as abdication. The words seemed to settle heavily between them. I watched Daniel's posture shift, the certainty draining from his shoulders. So what is this? He asked more quietly. A test? Mr. Whitman studied him for a long moment. No, he said. It is a correction. Richard opened another folder and placed a second set of documents on the table. Effective immediately, he said in a measured tone, all major financial decisions require direct authorization from Mr. Harold Whitman. Additionally, the pending sale of the South Division is suspended. Daniel's face paled slightly. You cannot do that, he said. The contracts are already drafted. Drafted, Richard repeated. Not executed. Mr. Whitman's voice remained steady. You were prepared to sell a division your grandfather built without consulting the board, he said. You assumed authority that was never permanent. Daniel looked from his father to the papers and back again, as if the diner itself had betrayed him. You embarrassed me here, he said suddenly, his voice tightening. Mr. Whitman tilted his head slightly. You chose this location when you decided to mock me in front of strangers, he replied. I simply chose not to respond until now. The simplicity of that statement seemed to carry more weight than any raised voice could have. Daniel glanced toward the other customers, aware of their presence for the first time. The humiliation he had intended for his father had quietly circled back. What do you want? He asked at last, the edge in his voice replaced with something closer to uncertainty. Mr. Whitman folded the documents neatly into a stack. I want you to learn the difference between control and stewardship, he said. One consumes. The other builds. He looked toward the window where the black sedans remained parked outside. You believed I had nothing left because I stopped competing with you, he continued. You mistook silence for surrender. Daniel swallowed, his confidence unraveling in small, visible pieces. And now, he asked. Mr. Whitman stood slowly, adjusting his blazer. He did not loom. He did not threaten. He simply occupied his space fully. Now, he said quietly, we begin again. Properly. He turned to Richard. Schedule a full board review for next week, he instructed. And prepare the revised oversight terms. Richard nodded immediately. Yes, sir. The word sir landed differently now. Daniel remained standing near the booth, the papers still in his hand, his reflection faintly visible in the diner window. Mr. Whitman looked at him one final time, not with anger, but with something far more deliberate. Leadership, he said softly, is earned every day. Not inherited once. Then he reached for his wallet, placed exact change on the table beside his untouched toast, and glanced at me with the same calm expression he had worn every morning. Thank you, Emily, he said. For the coffee. And as he walked toward the door, the bell rang once more, but this time it did not sound ordinary at all. The door closed behind Mr. Harold Whitman with a soft chime, and for a long moment no one in the diner moved. Daniel remained standing beside the booth, the documents still clutched in his hand as if they might rearrange themselves into something more favorable. If he stared at them long enough. The two suited men gathered their folders with quiet efficiency, nodding politely to Carl before stepping outside toward the black sedans. The low hum of engines starting drifted in through the glass. I stood near the counter, my heart still beating faster than usual, trying to reconcile the image of the elderly man who counted out exact change every morning with the founder who had just reasserted control over a company that built half the county. Daniel finally exhaled sharply and looked around, noticing the eyes that quickly turned away. He smoothed the front of his jacket, though the gesture did little to restore the composure he had worn so easily before. This is not over, he muttered under his breath, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to me, to the empty booth, or to himself. He placed the documents back on the table, then gathered them again, as if unsure whether leaving them behind would make the situation feel less real. Without another word, he walked toward the door, his steps faster than when he had entered. The bell rang again, and then he was gone. The diner slowly returned to motion. Plates clinked. Someone cleared their throat. The toddler resumed tapping his spoon against the table. Carl approached me, shaking his head. Well, he said quietly, that was not part of the breakfast special. I managed a small smile, though my thoughts were elsewhere. I walked back to the booth and began clearing Mr. Whitman's dishes. His coffee cup was nearly empty. His toast untouched, as always. But beneath the napkin, I noticed something I had not seen before. A second business card, slightly different from the first. This one included an address. Whitman Industries headquarters, Riverside Boulevard, 15 miles north of town. My fingers hovered over it for a moment before I slipped it into my apron pocket beside the first. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine orders and quiet conversations about what had just unfolded. Customers spoke in low voices, speculating about companies and trusts and fathers and sons. I answered questions about refills and side orders, but my mind kept replaying the steady way Mr. Whitman had spoken. Leadership is earned every day. Not inherited once. By noon, the diner had emptied. Sunlight shifted across the floor, turning the chrome edges duller and softer. I wiped down the counter slowly, thinking about the address on the card. 15 miles was not far. A 20-minute drive. I told myself it was none of my business. I was a waitress. He was a founder. Yet he had asked me to join the table. He had placed that card in my hand intentionally. Around 1 o'clock, Carl approached me again. You are off in 30 minutes, he said. If you are planning to follow a corporate drama, you might as well do it on your own time. I blinked. I am not following anything, I replied, though the words sounded less certain than I intended. He smiled knowingly. Just remember, he added, men who build things rarely give up the blueprint. After my shift ended, I changed out of my apron and stood outside the diner for a moment, staring down Maple Street. The town looked the same as it always had. Hardware store on the corner. Post office across from it. Traffic light that took too long to change. Nothing suggested that a power shift had just occurred over oatmeal and black coffee. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the second card. The address felt heavier now. I imagined a glass building overlooking the river, conference rooms, polished floors. I imagined Daniel arriving there, expecting to command, only to find doors no longer opening as easily. The thought was not satisfying in a cruel way. It was clarifying. I realized that what had unfolded that morning was not revenge. It was restoration. Mr. Whitman had not raised his voice. He had not defended himself in the moment of humiliation. He had waited. And in waiting, he had retained control. I glanced once more at the diner window, at the booth where he sat every morning at 7:15. For 8 months, I had seen only an elderly man eating oatmeal. Now I understood that I had been witnessing something else entirely. A man observing quietly. Measuring carefully. Choosing his timing. I folded the card and placed it back into my pocket. Tomorrow would still come at 7:15. The coffee would still pour dark and steady. But nothing about Maple Street felt ordinary anymore. The next morning I did not drive home after my shift. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes with the engine off, the business card resting on the dashboard where I had placed it the night before. Whitman Industries headquarters, Riverside Boulevard. The river ran wide and steady along the north edge of town, lined with newer office buildings and carefully trimmed landscaping. It was a different world from Maple Street. I told myself I had no reason to go. Curiosity was not a qualification. But his words from the diner echoed quietly in my mind. In case you ever decide you want more than this place can offer. I started the engine before I could overthink it and drove north, the morning sun glinting off windshields as traffic thickened near the business district. 15 miles passed quickly. When I turned onto Riverside Boulevard, the buildings rose in clean glass lines against the sky, reflecting the water beyond them. Whitman Industries stood near the center, a 12-story structure of steel and tinted windows, understated but solid. The company logo was simple and sharp against the stone facade. I parked across the street, my hands resting on the steering wheel for a moment before I stepped out. The air near the river carried a cooler breeze. Inside the lobby, the floors were polished marble, the ceiling high and bright. A receptionist sat behind a sleek white desk, her posture straight, her expression professional but not unkind. I suddenly felt very aware of my simple blouse and modest shoes. "Good morning," she said. "How may I help you?" I placed the business card gently on the desk. "I was asked to come," I replied, hearing the uncertainty in my own voice. She glanced at the card, then at her screen. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "One moment, please." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly. Within seconds, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened. Richard stepped out, the same gray suit, the same measured pace. He approached with a polite nod. "Emily Carter?" he asked. I nodded. "Mr. Whitman is expecting you." "Expecting me?" The words felt surreal. The elevator ride to the top floor was smooth and silent. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked smaller than usual. When the doors opened, we stepped into a wide hallway lined with framed photographs. Black and white images of construction sites from decades past. Steel beams rising into the sky. Workers in hard hats standing proudly beside newly completed buildings. At the end of the hallway, double glass doors stood open. Harold Whitman was standing near the window, looking out over the river. The city skyline stretched beyond, cranes and rooftops catching the sunlight. He did not turn immediately when we entered. "You came," he said calmly, as if I had merely arrived for coffee. "You said today would be less ordinary," I replied softly. He smiled slightly at that and finally turned to face me. In the bright office light, he looked different from the man in the diner booth. The same blazer, yes, but here it did not look worn. It looked intentional. Like a uniform chosen carefully. "Sit," he said gently, gesturing toward the chairs near his desk. I lowered myself into one, trying to quiet the questions in my mind. He moved to his desk and rested his hands on its polished surface. "Tell me," he said, "what did you see yesterday?" I hesitated, unsure what answer he expected. "I saw a son who thought he had already won," I said finally. "And a father who was not finished." He studied me for a moment, the way he had in the diner. "Measuring. Most people see only what is loud," he said. "Very few notice what is quiet." He walked to the window again, gesturing toward the buildings along the river. "Every structure you see began with someone willing to wait for the right moment to build," he continued. "Impatience destroys foundations." I thought of Daniel's quick movements, his sharp tone, the certainty that had cracked under pressure. "Why involve me?" I asked gently. "I am just a waitress." Mr. Whitman turned back toward me, his expression firm but not dismissive. "No one is just anything," he said. "I had been coming to your diner for 8 months. I watched how you treated customers who could not tip. I watched how you listened. How you remembered details. You built trust without knowing it." The word trust settled between us with new meaning. "What are you saying?" I asked quietly. He walked back to his desk and opened a folder that had been waiting there. Inside were documents, neatly organized, and at the top was a letter addressed to Emily Carter. "Whitman Industries is launching a community development initiative," he said. "Scholarships, apprenticeship programs, small business grants. I need someone who understands the value of steady work. Not inherited titles." My heart pounded again, but differently this time. Not from shock. From possibility. "You are offering me a job?" I asked. He nodded once. "I am offering you an opportunity to learn," he corrected. "And to build." Outside the window, the river moved calmly beneath the sunlight. In the distance, cranes lifted steel beams into place on a new structure rising along the waterfront. I realized then that the diner had never been the whole story. It had been a beginning. And Harold Whitman had never lost control. He had simply chosen the right moment to reclaim it. The letter with my name printed across the top did not feel real in my hands. Emily Carter. The ink was crisp, the paper thick and deliberate, nothing like the thin order pads I used every day at Maple Street Diner. I read the first paragraph twice before looking up at Harold Whitman again. He remained standing by the window, hands loosely folded behind his back, the river stretching wide and steady beyond the glass. "You do not have to answer today," he said calmly. "Opportunities are strongest when chosen, not rushed." I glanced back at the letter. Community Development Initiative. Training period. Compensation listed clearly, far beyond what I earned refilling coffee and carrying plates. Benefits. Structured mentorship. It was detailed. Intentional. Nothing about it felt impulsive. "Why now?" I asked quietly. "Because timing matters," he replied. "Yesterday you saw the difference between authority and responsibility. Today you decide which one you wish to learn." His tone was not persuasive. It was measured, the way he had spoken in the diner. Outside the office door, footsteps passed in quiet efficiency. Whitman Industries did not feel chaotic. It felt structured, like a machine that had been recalibrated. "And Daniel?" I asked carefully. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle tightening at the corner of his eyes. "Daniel will learn as well," he said. "Leadership requires humility. If it does not arrive naturally, it must arrive through consequence." There was no anger in his voice. Only certainty. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back on the desk. "I have never worked in an office like this," I admitted. "I do not know corporate language. I do not know how to read half of those documents." He gave a slight nod, as if expecting that answer. You know how to observe, he said. You know how to listen. You know how to treat people who cannot offer you advantage. Those skills are rarer than spreadsheets. I let out a slow breath. The weight of the choice pressed gently against my ribs. Maple Street Diner was familiar. Safe. Predictable. This building was none of those things. Yet standing there, I realized that safety and stagnation often wore the same face. If I accept, I asked softly, what happens next? He walked back to the desk and slid another folder toward me. You begin as an apprentice within the community division, he said. You will attend board sessions as an observer. You will learn how capital moves and how decisions affect families beyond spreadsheets. His eyes met mine directly. And you will see what stewardship truly means. I thought of the men in hard hats from the framed photographs in the hallway. The steel beams rising into open sky. The diner booth at 7:15 every morning. The slow patience of someone building something that lasts. You were watching me for 8 months, I said. It was not a question. He nodded once. People reveal themselves in small routines, he replied. How they handle boredom. How they treat those who cannot benefit them. You were consistent. A quiet knock sounded at the door before it opened slightly. Daniel stood there, no jacket this time, tie loosened, his expression restrained but no longer sharp. He paused when he saw me seated inside. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not arrogance. Something closer to realization. You asked to see me, Daniel said to his father. Mr. Whitman gestured calmly. Come in. Daniel stepped fully into the office, glancing briefly at the folder in front of me. I reviewed the documents, he said evenly. The board supports the oversight revision. It sounded rehearsed. Controlled. Mr. Whitman inclined his head slightly. And your decision? Daniel's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before relaxing. I will remain as Chief Operations Officer, he said carefully. Under the revised structure. The phrasing mattered. Not owner. Not controller. Officer. Mr. Whitman nodded. Then we moved forward. Silence settled in the room, not hostile, but heavy with recalibration. Daniel's gaze shifted toward me again. You are joining the company, he asked, his tone neutral but edged with curiosity. I held his gaze steadily. I am considering it, I replied. He studied me for a moment, perhaps recognizing the same steadiness he had once overlooked in the diner booth. Then welcome to Whitman Industries, he said, the words measured. It was not warm. But it was not mocking either. Progress sometimes begins quietly. After Daniel left the office, the door closing softly behind him, Mr. Whitman returned to the window. Change rarely arrives with applause, he said. It arrives with adjustment. I picked up the letter again. The river below continued its steady course, unaffected by board meetings or family disputes. Construction cranes in the distance lifted steel into place with patient precision. I thought of Maple Street. Of coffee refills and exact change. Of a man who counted coins while holding authority most people could not imagine. I accept, I said finally, the words steady in my mouth. Mr. Whitman turned toward me, and for the first time since I had known him, his expression softened beyond calculation. Good, he said simply. Then tomorrow, we begin building. Outside the glass walls of the office, the city moved forward, unaware that inside one quiet room, a new foundation had just been laid. My first official morning at Whitman Industries began without oatmeal or the scent of brewed coffee drifting through a small diner. It began with a security badge clipped carefully to my blouse and a schedule printed in clean, structured blocks of time. When I stepped into the lobby at 8:45, the marble floors reflected the sunlight pouring through the glass facade, and for a brief second I felt the familiar flicker of doubt. Maple Street Diner had predictable sounds. Here, everything was quiet but purposeful. People walked with direction, holding tablets and folders, their conversations measured and low. I reminded myself of what Harold Whitman had said. Opportunities are strongest when chosen. I had chosen. Richard met me near the elevators and handed me a slim binder labeled Community Development Initiative. Today you observe, he said calmly. You are not here to impress anyone. You are here to understand. The elevator carried us to the 11th floor, where a conference room overlooked the river. Inside, a long polished table stretched nearly the length of the room. Several board members were already seated, their expressions attentive but reserved. Daniel Whitman stood near the far end, reviewing a document on a tablet. When he looked up and saw me enter, there was no smirk this time. Only a brief, assessing glance before he returned to his screen. Harold Whitman entered last. He did not rush. He did not demand attention. Yet when he took his seat at the head of the table, the subtle shift in posture around the room made it clear who still held the foundation beneath this company. We begin, he said simply. The meeting moved quickly, but not recklessly. Financial updates. Operational adjustments. Then the topic shifted to the South Division sale that had been suspended. Daniel presented revised projections, his tone controlled and professional. The division remains profitable, he said. But reinvestment in modernization will require capital allocation from reserves. He did not look at his father while speaking, but his words were precise. Harold listened without interruption. When Daniel finished, silence settled over the table for a moment. What is the long-term impact on community employment? Harold asked calmly. Daniel paused, clearly anticipating financial questions rather than social ones. Employment remains stable for the next fiscal year, he answered. Beyond that, automation would reduce labor demand by approximately 15%. I felt the number settle in the room. 15% was not abstract. It was families. Mortgages. School tuition. Harold nodded once. Whitman Industries was built by men and women who believed their work mattered, he said evenly. Modernization is necessary. Displacement without preparation is negligence. He turned slightly toward me. Emily, what do you see? Every head at the table shifted in my direction. For a split second, the old instinct to shrink surfaced. But I remembered the diner booth. The patience in his voice. I see opportunity, I said carefully. If automation reduces positions, then apprenticeship programs could retrain workers for maintenance, oversight, and new technical roles. If the company invests in its people first, the transition strengthens loyalty instead of breaking it. My voice did not shake. I noticed Daniel watching me now, not dismissively, but analytically. One board member leaned forward slightly. That would require structured training partnerships, she said. And budget reallocation. Harold nodded. Which we will evaluate, he replied. Daniel tapped his tablet once before speaking again. If retraining offsets productivity loss, the model remains viable, he said. His tone was no longer defensive. It was collaborative. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The discussion continued. For nearly 2 hours, moving through budgets, timelines, and risk assessments. I took notes carefully, absorbing terminology, watching how Harold asked questions rather than delivered commands. He did not dominate the room. He guided it. When the meeting adjourned, board members filtered out in quiet conversation. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, reviewing figures. As I gathered my binder, he approached slowly. You handled that well, he said. It was not warm praise, but it was genuine acknowledgement. I only said what seemed practical, I replied. He studied me briefly, then gave a short nod. Practical is often overlooked, he said. I did not account for that. The admission was quiet, almost private. Harold joined us near the window, overlooking the river where cranes continued to lift steel into place. Growth requires recalibration, he said softly. Not replacement. Daniel looked at his father, and for the first time there was no tension in his expression. Only consideration. I will review the apprenticeship framework, he said. Harold inclined his head slightly. Good. As Daniel left the room, his pace was no longer sharp. It was deliberate. I stood beside Harold, watching the city below move steadily forward. You did not embarrass him, I said quietly. You gave him responsibility. Harold's gaze remained on the horizon. Respect built through fear collapses quickly, he replied. Respect built through accountability lasts. The river moved beneath us, constant and unhurried. In the distance, another steel beam was lifted into place, aligned carefully before being secured. I realized then that Whitman Industries was not being reclaimed through confrontation. It was being reshaped through discipline. And as I stood there with a binder in my hands instead of a coffee pot, I understood that building something lasting required patience not only in business, but in family as well. The foundation had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But firmly. The weeks that followed did not feel dramatic. There were no raised voices in conference rooms, no sudden announcements that shook the building. Instead, there was rhythm. Structure. Adjustment. I began arriving at Whitman Industries before 9 each morning, reviewing apprenticeship proposals and community outreach plans while learning how capital flowed through spreadsheets and contracts. Harold Whitman rarely gave long speeches. He asked questions. He listened. He allowed silence to stretch until the right answer surfaced. Daniel changed as well, though not in loud ways. His presentations became more deliberate. He referenced workforce impact alongside profit margins. He asked for data before making declarations. The board noticed. I noticed. One Thursday afternoon, nearly a month after the diner confrontation, Harold asked me to join him for a site visit. We drove 15 miles south to one of the original Whitman fabrication plants. The building stood wide and solid against the horizon, steel beams arching overhead, trucks moving in steady lines. Inside, workers moved with practiced efficiency. Some had been there for decades. Others were younger, recently hired. Harold walked the floor slowly, greeting employees by name when he could, listening more than speaking. Daniel joined us midway through the visit. He wore a hard hat and safety vest like everyone else, his polished shoes replaced with reinforced boots. He stood beside his father as a supervisor explained how automation would soon upgrade certain assembly lines. We can retrain 25% of the staff internally, the supervisor said. But the rest will need structured programs. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. We will expand the apprenticeship initiative, he replied. No layoffs without placement options. The words were firm, not performative. Harold glanced at him briefly, then at me. He did not smile. He did not need to. Later, as we stood near the loading dock watching a shipment depart, Daniel spoke quietly. I thought control meant speed, he admitted. Decisiveness. Efficiency. Harold folded his hands behind his back, eyes on the departing truck. Speed without stability collapses, he said calmly. You were building higher. I was ensuring the ground could hold it. Daniel let out a slow breath. I misjudged that. It was not a dramatic apology. It was recognition. And recognition carried more weight than defense ever had. That evening, I returned to Maple Street Diner for the first time in weeks. Not to work. Just to sit in the booth by the window at 7:15. The bell above the door chimed the same way it always had. Carl looked up from the counter and grinned. Promotion treating you well? He asked. I smiled. It is not a promotion, I said. It is a lesson. I ordered oatmeal and black coffee, just as Harold had every morning. I counted exact change from my wallet and left $1 tip. The booth felt smaller than I remembered. The diner quieter than it used to seem. Yet it was here that the shift had begun. Not with contracts or board votes. With patience. With observation. With restraint. The next morning, Whitman Industries announced its expanded apprenticeship program publicly. scholarships for technical training, partnerships with local community colleges, guarantees of placement for workers transitioning from manual roles to automated oversight. The press release carried both Harold and Daniel's names beneath it. Founder and Chief Operations Officer. Side by side. In the conference room later that day, Daniel turned toward his father after the announcement. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. Harold adjusted his blazer, the same navy one he had worn in the diner. "You underestimated patience," he corrected gently. Daniel gave a faint smile. "I will not make that mistake again." As the room emptied, Harold approached me near the window overlooking the river. Cranes still lifted steel into place in the distance. The city continued building upward. "You see now," he said softly, "why silence can be stronger than reaction." I nodded. "You did not defeat him," I replied. "You recalibrated him." Harold's gaze remained steady on the horizon. "Family," he said, "is not about victory. It is about stewardship. Of legacy. Of people. Of character." The river below moved without interruption, steady and unhurried, reflecting the sky in quiet consistency. I realized then that the diner confrontation had never been about humiliation. It had been about timing. About allowing arrogance to reveal itself fully before correcting it. Daniel had walked into that booth believing his father had nothing left. He walked out understanding that foundations do not disappear simply because they are unseen. Weeks later, when Harold returned to Maple Street for breakfast, he did not sit alone. Daniel joined him. They spoke in low, measured tones, not as adversaries, but as partners recalibrating direction. I poured their coffee and stepped back, watching from a respectful distance. Leadership, I understood now, was not about commanding the loudest room. It was about holding steady when others rushed ahead. And sometimes, the most powerful move is not confrontation. It is waiting until the right moment to stand, speak calmly, and rebuild what was always yours to guide.